Hey guys, welcome to Budget Bros MTG, where I try to build powerful decks that you can actually afford. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive on a topic that I have a lot of interest in, and I think a lot of you guys do too, which is how you can build a powerful budget deck and how to build powerful budget decks in general. If this content and deck techs and similar introspective content interest you, a like and a subscription would be much appreciated. So, how to build powerful budget decks? I think first we would have to analyze what a high power deck looks like. So, in the large majority, a high powered deck in most people's minds is going to be either a CEDH deck or a bracket 4 deck. Now, I would argue that the bracket 4 decks, in terms of just like true raw power, are generally going to be a little bit more geared towards the actual optimization of the deck. Whereas the CDH decks are optimized for their meta. So they do have to dedicate specific slots to stopping stuff that would happen at the table. Whereas a bracket 4 can be a lot more greedy and just dump as much of its power into the deck itself and the optimization of the deck itself as possible. So for this kind of scenario and the topic that we're going to talk about today, we're going to be talking about high power bracket 4, like budgetless bracket 4. If you can imagine the guy that walks into your LGS and, sits down at the table and he has every answer to every problem, and you could tell that he dumped tons of money into his deck and just the tables in general, that if you were to sit down, you would notice that they were an extremely high powered deck. That's the framing that we're going to use for this. A niche that I like to play in, the $100 budget competitive, falls into a cool middle grounds between, I would say, a fringe CEDH deck and a high power bracket 4. So the decks that I build here on the channel can also sit comfortably at those tables. And I know that might sound crazy to you now, just starting out, but I think by the end of this, you will either start to see my perspective, or at the very least, I hope that you do. So, how do we go about building a powerful budget deck? I think it's first important to look at what difficulties that people could face during the deck building process. So, obviously, lack of a budget is going to be a big thing. We can't run the heuristic studies and the free counter spells and the free interaction and the moxes to be able to ramp out turn 1 into a 3 or 4 mana commander. We don't have access to those things when we are building on a $100 budget or even just a lower budget in general. And the biggest thing kind of take out of that is it's not so much a lack on the deck. You know what I mean? It's not, the deck won't be any worse because of the lack of those things, as long as we're building in a constructive and thoughtful way. One of the big traps that you can fall into as a newer player or even an intermediate player, I think, is to rely heavily on EDHREC as a source of all of your data points. If you go on EDHREC for any given, let's just say, token commander, you'll notice if they have the colors white, they're probably running a Mondrak Glory Dominus, it doubles the tokens that you would make. If you would make one or more tokens, you create twice that many instead. So it's a true token doubler. But if we look at that at face value, that $40, $50 card, now I'm not arguing in any situation that Mondrak is a bad card, but I think even if I had the budget for it in my decks, I would be hard pressed to include it for the simple fact that it's a 4 mana enabler card. It does absolutely nothing the turn it comes down. You're going to waste an entire turn 4 playing this creature out and then hoping that you survive a rotation to be able to do something meaningful with it the next turn. And you'll notice a high density of these style of enabler cards. They play a very specific tune very well, but they don't do as much as they could for a deck in general. And the way I come to this conclusion is I do my deck building process quite different than what I've heard other YouTubers and other people in spaces outside of the $100 budget competitive. I do it quite differently. So to start off my process, I'll pick my commander. For this example, we can use Rowan, Scion of War. You can tap her, and then spells you cast this turn that are black and or red cost X less to cast, where X is the amount of life you've lost this turn. Activate only as a sorcery. And most people will stop right there. They're going to look at the very surface level of what a commander wants to do, and then they'll build around that. That's why if you scroll down on the EDHREC page, you'll see that there's like a 54% inclusion rate of a card like Phyrexian Arena that says at the beginning of your upkeep, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. With the thoughts, I imagine that when you cast this out the turn after you cast your commander, then at least you have 1 life to rely on. Or cards like Toxic Deluge, which, as an additional cost to cast this spell, pay X life. All creatures get -X until end of turn. I'm not saying Toxic Deluge is a bad card, it's a fantastic card. But I think for the things that Rowan wants to do, it doesn't make much sense in this scenario, for the simple fact that she can only be activated as a sorcery. So what I'm asking you to do is just take a little bit deeper look at the commander, instead of just a big X spells commander, which is a definite theme that you can build into, and that if I build the deck, I would build into. But she also plays really well into a storm style deck, due to the fact that it's not just the next spell, it's spells in general this turn you cast. So if you can find a way to ping yourself for 2, 3, even 4 damage, pretty much every card in your deck can be reduced down to a 1 or 2 cost card, which would allow cards like Big Score to actually become mana positive. So with that being said, after you've analyzed your commander and you've looked at just a little bit deeper than the surface level, I would recommend you start with your win con and work backwards. Now, win con is this kind of buzzword, and some people agree that a deck should have a win con, and some people don't agree, and everything else. But the deck, at the end of the day, you're building this deck to be able to win. Of course, you want it to be a fun kind of experience for your friends, depending on whatever power level you're in, that will look different. But a deck has to win. And it doesn't always, like, WinCon doesn't have to be combos. Sure, I might enjoy combos. I enjoy the combo play style of being able to tutor for like the exact piece that I need and having cards interact in cool and funky ways that creates a win scenario for me. But that may not be your thing. When I say start with your win con and work backwards, it looks different for each commander. Rowan's win con would look more in lines with something like a Torment of Hailfire, whereas Vren's win con would look more something along the lines of making sure that you have a decent suite of edict style effects to be able to maximize the amount of rats you would get each turn. After you've identified your win con, you don't want to start adding in synergy quite yet. You actually want to fill out your veggies. It doesn't matter how synergistic and cool a deck is at the end of the day if it doesn't win. You need card draw, you need mana acceleration, and you need a good amount of interaction. I would actually recommend numbers beyond and higher than what a lot of the YouTube community recommends. The best cards in the format and the best cards in the game usually die to a single piece of cheap interaction. So we know how we want to win. And we have the card draw, the ramp, and the interaction to be able to support that game plan and make it a feasible, doable thing. That's when I start adding in the synergy. Now, you may, at that second, kind of pause because the decks that I like to build are very synergy forward. And if you look at any of my deck lists, it's usually a synergy soup by the end of it. But the way that I add that in is not by just having a synergy piece be a synergy piece. So in this example, let's say I'm building a deck with a flying commander or that has a high theme of flying creatures in general. Well, Counterspell is 2 blue mana pips, which in a mono blue deck may not be a problem, but if you're a 3 or even a 4 color deck, it can become a little bit of an issue. In addition, it's like $1.50. So when we're working on a $100 budget, that counterspell can easily be replaced by something like a Lofty Denial. which is 1 generic and 1 blue, counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. So that's not that great. But if you control a creature with flying, counter that spell unless its controller pays 4 instead. 99% of situations, someone isn't just going to have 4 extra mana floating up after making a big splashy play. So, in a deck that would want flying creatures in it anyways, something like Lofty Denial makes a lot of sense. And it's just other pieces like that. For example, in the Kefka list that I put together with Budget Pub Stomper, you have creatures like Nabon Dean of Iteration that doubles up enter the battlefield effects from our wizards. Now, it's not a wizard deck in the slightest, but a couple of our really key cards are wizards. For example, Kefka, our commander, and Dualcaster Mage. So, Dualcaster Mage is a combo piece, obviously, in the deck, but he's also just a generically good card. So, once he enters the battlefield, he's going to copy target instant or sorcery spell, and then you cast the copy without paying its mana cost. So, just by himself, Dualcaster Mage can counter a counter spell. For example, you go to cast Kefka, and someone attempts to counter it. Well, you can cast Dualcaster Mage to copy their counter spell and counter their counter, essentially. But with Nabon on the battlefield, you add another step to that kind of synergy soup. Let's say somebody were to go try to remove Kefka, and they cast something like a Path to Exile. Well, in this situation, if we don't have a counter, Kefka's probably going to get removed, and that's going to set us back. But with a Dualcaster Mage, while a Nabon is on the field, it allows us to set them back even further than they just sent us back by doubling up on the spell. So simple things like that, when you're looking at synergy, it doesn't just have to be synergy. And card draw doesn't just have to be card draw. And removal and counters don't just have to be interaction. They can all tie into your core theme as long as you're willing to put a little bit of effort in and do the digging to find the cards that are there. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the mana bases that we now have access to at $100 budget competitive or just budget in general. The quality of the untapped mana sources that can add multiple different colors is astounding. You have a lot of access to some really good dual lands at a very inexpensive price where that wasn't entirely possible 1 to 2 years ago, which allows you to have a lot more freedom in the amount of colors that you want to run in a deck. I've seen even 5-color decks do fantastically at $100 budget competitive. With that, I think that should be enough info to get you started on the path to reanalyzing how you're going about building a budget deck or just any deck in general. And the fact that what you're really aiming for at the end of all of this, as long as you're framing this in the bracket 4 scene and in high power scene, we're building these decks to be able to win. And the win attempt itself won't matter so much if we don't do the foundation work that's required to get to that point. And if the deck itself doesn't work up until that point to be able to get us there. So that's about it for me, guys. I enjoyed being able to talk about this. I think it's a topic that a lot of people struggle with, including myself to this day. It's still something that I'm working on. I'm not a guru or a master by any means. I'm just taking a little bit of a deeper look at it and then sharing those thoughts with you guys. And I'd love if you shared your thoughts back with me. I'm still super small, so any comments in the comment section, I'd love to open and have a discussion. Once again, if this is something that you enjoy, subscribe because I'm going to be doing these videos and I'd love to be able to show you what's up my sleeve next. Anyways, guys, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you for listening in on this. Take care and good luck. Have fun.